Very good. I'd like to begin my talk today by reading a passage from the Tani Sho. If you place your hands together in Gasho. I know nothing at all of good or evil, for if I could know thoroughly, as Amida Tathagata knows, that an act was good, then I would know good. If I could know thoroughly, as the Tathagata knows, that an act was evil, then I would know evil. But with a foolish being full of blind passions in this fleeting world, this burning house, all matters without exception are empty and false, totally without truth and sincerity. The Nembutsu alone is true and real. Namo Amida Butsu. Namandabs, 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 namandabs. Today, we chanted the Shoshinge. And the Shoshinge is the only thing that we chant that was actually written by Shinran. And it's a summary of the teachings that it acts like a compass in our life that points us to the Nembutsu. And the portion that I just read, or the portion that, Lori read, reminds us that although our ego-driven views cloud our ability to see the truth, the light of Amida shines through to accept us just as we are. In today's world, we see so many walls and barriers being built between us, and we focus on labeling people who don't agree with us as the other. They're either with us or against us. And that dualistic framework that we fall into is about either or and not both and, as Don Samuels talked about in his message, for those of you who heard his talk. And Buddhism really is about both and. To truly believe what Shinran is saying, that all of us are accepted as we are, is just as important to understand with so much divisiveness. And there's nowhere that Shinran's or that Amida's light, described as the immeasurable depth of the Buddha's wisdom and compassion, does not shine. And as the Tani Sho says, even a good person attains birth in the Pure Land. So it goes without saying that an evil person will. And we tend to think of the good person as ourselves and the evil person as someone else, but is that really so? So Connie and I just returned from visiting Chicago to visit Connie's mom and family, and Connie's mom is also on this Zoom service. And while we were there, I gave a Dharma message for the Midwest Buddhist Temple's service. And due to the safety concerns, I wasn't allowed to be in their temple. So I spoke from an empty room in Connie's sister's apartment, pretending to be in an empty hondo, or the empty temple, where Reverend Ron was. I was speaking into a computer screen, not really knowing if anyone was actually watching online through his Facebook live feed. And so with all those layers, it was really kind of an odd experience. And I thought it would be a lonely, maybe isolating feeling, but then just before service started, so many of our Sangha members logged on in support, and it made me comforted and happy. And seeing your names and faces gave me joy. And even seeing Cheryl and Lori's faces, it gave me joy. And I was reminded that I'm truly supported by so many things, seen and unseen, and it's my blind passions that obstruct true reality. So it made me reflect on how separated we are physically, which can give the feeling of being alone and more isolated during this pandemic. Yet still trying to stay connected as we all are trying to do our best with the Zoom service today. So that's the picture of me with the picture of their empty hondo behind me, even though I wasn't actually there. So pre-COVID, being alone in our usual life setting, and it could be a helpful refuge to regenerate, to think and reflect, to gather our thoughts. But the feeling of being alone today, I think, feels a little different under the orders of staying safe or keeping safe during the pandemic. And it can carry an anxiety or a weight on our shoulders. And as humans, we need others to support us. And the Sangha in Buddhism is just that. It's a community in which we take refuge. And the Buddha emphasized this in his teachings. The three treasures that Frank recited today says that we take refuge in the Buddha, or we go to the Buddha for guidance. We go to the Dharma for guidance, we go to the Sangha for guidance. And the Sangha is, of course, the community of followers, and that's all of us here together today. And I've heard the phrase being alone together in this time of physical distancing and making connections with technology, which kind of sounds like an oxymoron. And I remember when Kyle was an infant, or a toddler really, he would have play dates, but he didn't really know how to interact with other kids yet. And I think you could probably argue maybe he still doesn't, but that's a different Dharma talk for another day. But we could call that playing by himself with others. But still, even if he focused on his own play, he was still around other kids, and whether or not he consciously knew it, he gained some knowledge of being around others and socialization. For our Zoom services, I can see a few faces of those logged on, but I don't really get a sense of what you're thinking. I have to admit that I usually think I'm very hilariously funny, so don't burst my bubble. The phrase being alone together implies that these two things are not separate. It's not an either or like we typically think, but that they are the same, non-dual. In non-pandemic times, this can also be the case when we are in a crowd, yet feel isolated. Is this any different? Maybe and maybe not. And I think today feels different because today we're doing it in a positive way. We're thinking of the safety of others and the conditions for our gathering, the situation we're in, makes the intention maybe more uplifting. And with the forced shutdown, like us, everything and everyone has moved to more virtual gatherings for safety. So we've had more services and more people attending than usual, especially from those out of town. Like, sometimes the Dettermans are able to log in from Hawaii. We get Stephanie from Grand Rapids, Lori, of course, today from Cleveland, Chiami's family from Japan, as well as New York. But, this is just like what I hear happening for other temples across the country. And it's been a wonderful way to stay connected to each other. And of course, with Zoom, it allows us to also see each other in real time. And more people are hearing the Dharma from the Twin Cities than if we had services in person. So such a positive comes out of what we perceive as a negative situation. Yet, I also reflect, is this truly being together? As a Zoom participant in many meetings and seminars, if you're like me, it's easy to get distracted. And sometimes I'm multitasking in front of my screen, I'm snacking. I'm often guilty of not actively listening or truly being present. But today I think it's also okay if I know that some of our participants are currently in a bar drinking an adult beverage, which is okay. But to be honest, I'm sometimes lucky to even wearing pants. But don't worry, as I made a point to put this on that just so you know that I'm wearing pants right now, and probably words that are usually never spoken in Dharma talks before. But then technology like this begins, when technology like this begins to engineer intimacy and this ability to stay close in some manner, relationships can be reduced to mere connections. And then easy connection becomes redefined as some level of intimacy. So our intentions may be good, but is it really better or worse? And maybe both or neither. And the definition really seems to be dependent on the circumstances. On the other hand, with so much constant connection, there are also anxieties of disconnection, a kind of panic if you aren't connected. From a Buddhist perspective, what is the idea of the self when we project ourselves through technology? And should it be extended to our computers? Is it an alternative self, a second self, or really our true self? So Shinran quotes from Shandao to think about this when he says, "We should not express outwardly signs of wisdom, goodness, or diligence, for inwardly we are possessed of falsity. We are filled with all manner of greed, anger, perversity, deceit, wickedness, and cunning. And it is difficult to put an end to our evil nature." So I'm pretty sure Shinran didn't have online activity on his mind at the time but it still applies to this new application. So what is the true me? What am I projecting on my screen, and what is truly inside of me? Before COVID, it was often said that technology was endangering our relationships. It was ramping down our interaction. People would rather text than have a personal conversation, and personal action was getting less frequent. And the always on communication and internet speed and brevity had changed the rules of engagement. Technology became a means to keep us connected at all times. We tried to fit things into our busy schedule, and the text-driven world of rapid response really didn't give you time for self-reflection. It didn't make it impossible, but it also did very little to cultivate it. And with all this urgency of communication, we didn't allow for downtime, for stillness. These are all things we most often may be labeled as negative. Now with COVID, I recently read that our online usage has increased 500%. So we now think of technology as enhancing human interaction rather than reducing it. So we're grateful to be able to live stream morning service like today. And the shelter in place restrictions, it slowed us down. We have more time. We're using technology to enhance our connectivity. So for now, for the most part, we're happy that technology brings us closer together and it's allowing us to work from home safely. Schools have pivoted to online learning. Social media is a way for us to stay connected to family and friends that we can't see in person. But reliable internet is more precious than ever. And I know I take broadband access for granted. There are so many who don't have this access, whether it's for economic or technical reasons. So not having technology now is almost like being left out of society. And like many things during this pandemic, it's accentuating the economic disparities of our world. And as we reflect on all this, what has changed? Is it the technology or is it us? It's like the Buddhist parable you might be familiar with. It's a story about a farmer and his son whose horse ran away. And the neighbors all said how unfortunate he was. And he said, maybe. But then the horse came back with 3 stray wild horses. His neighbors all said how lucky he was. And he said, maybe. While riding one of the wild horses, his son fell off and broke his leg. His neighbors all said how unfortunate that was. And he said, maybe. And then the military came to take all the young men into battle, but did not take his farmer's son because of his injury. And the neighbors then said how lucky he was. His son did not have to go to battle. And he said, maybe. I think the point of the story is that we tend to place a label on events like good or bad, lucky or unlucky, when it isn't necessarily so. And we don't have the capability to see the truth through our lens of understanding. And this labeling is what causes us undue suffering. The label we place can change relative to the changing circumstances and conditions surrounding the event, like our thoughts about communication technology. Now, this farmer story might be interpreted as one of passivity, that the farmer is passively accepting the results of actions. But I think it's about him actively freeing himself from conditioned responses and undue suffering that his neighbors are relaying. And whenever we interpret a situation as being a disaster or an opportunity, it shapes the way we feel and it shapes the way that we respond. You know, I recently watched a Netflix program called Social Dilemma. I don't know if some of you may have already seen it as well. And discusses the overt and covert influences of social media through interviews with former tech influencers from the major tech companies. And one interviewee calls social media a simultaneous utopia and dystopia, and showing the sameness of seemingly opposite thoughts. Now, how can it be both utopia and dystopia? And it claims that social media is humanity's greatest existential threat. It's a very revealing and scary view of how social media manipulates the user and what the future could hold if things don't change. But I don't know, is it the social media or is it the way that social media surfaces and amplifies the worst in humanity? Is it the technology or is it us? Greed, anger, and ignorance is ever present in us, and it really becomes the question of how each of us perceives and utilizes it. And this Netflix series was an alarming view of the effects of social media on us. But what was difficult to hear for me was the inability of the inventors of this media to talk about how to correct it. What is happening today was supposedly none of their intention. And nobody had really an easy answer. And the issue is very complicated and nuanced, with discussions framed by things like addiction problems, inequality, economics, hate speech, privacy, just to name a few. And people are being controlled by the algorithms of social media. But I think Buddhism can help us wade through the trauma and suffering caused by social media. Now, if we go back to Shakyamuni Buddha in his first sermon, it described in the Pali Canon, the Buddha spoke of the middle way between asceticism and indulgence and the Eightfold Path. And that path is still valid and valuable in a digital age. Technology's value is the value we give it as a society and as individuals in millions of large and small decisions that are made every day. Decisions that we each individually make every day. And it's our clouds and mists of greed and desire, anger and hatred that covers the sky of true and real Shinjin that the Shoshinge explains in the passage that Lori read. Technology reshapes our world into something that can seem unfamiliar and even strange. but we're still in human territory. Territory we can navigate with wisdom and insight, guided by the light of Amida Buddha if we choose to do so. So Reverend Bridge has an article in the October Wheel of Dharma, for those of you who get that. It talks about how we're led to the middle way by the Nembutsu, and understand it's very difficult to accomplish on our own. And Cheryl posted a link to the Sangha's Facebook page if you don't have a copy. Now, each and every encounter with the Dharma in our lives gives us the chance to see the light of Amida Buddha. Struggling with the frustration and joys in our everyday interactions and our shelter in place gives us the opportunity to reflect on how Amida Buddha's wisdom and compassion works in our lives. This can be the source of our spiritual growth. And so much has changed during the pandemic and shelter in place isolation. It's very easy to label them as negative, but are they really that way? If we see our current circumstance in the light of Amida, we can see it with level of gratitude for the gifts that we have received. I'd like to close by reading the passage from the Shoshinge that Lori read earlier. So if you please join me in Gasho. And this passage, I think, reminds us how Amida's light helps guide us to see our blind passions that cloud our ability to navigate these technological innovations. The light of compassion that grasps us illumines and protects us always. The darkness of our ignorance is already broken through. Still, the clouds and mists of greed and desire, anger and hatred cover as always the sky of true and real Shinjin. But though the light of the sun is veiled by clouds and mists, beneath the clouds and mists there is brightness, not dark. When one realizes Shinjin, seeing and revering and great joy, one immediately leaps crosswise, closing off the 5 evil courses. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.